Hi, it's Monica from Penny Spool Quilts, and in this video I'm going to show you how to make a flange binding for your quilt. So there are two ways of making flange binding. There's probably more, but these two. We have the option of the wide flange or the very narrow one. So it depends on how you cut the fabrics to make these two options. So the wide one has a 1/4 inch flange, and it is cut with the narrow strip at 1 1/4 inch and the wider strip at the back at 1 3/4 inches. And that is what gives you the 1/4 inch flange there. The narrower one with the narrow flange, the red strip is cut at 1 3/8. So the flange is 1/8 of an inch. So the narrow strip is 1 3/8 of an inch, and the wider strip at the back, the green one, is 1 5/8. Now the important part is that the narrower strip is actually the one that's going to be the main binding, and the wider strip, because this is how you fold it around, so the wider strip, the green in this case, is what ends up being the flange. But I'm putting the measurements for these in the comments for the video. So the first thing to do is cut your strips. So like I mentioned, the narrower strip is the one that's going to be the visible part of the binding, the bigger part of the binding. And I've measured, or I put washi tape on my ruler here because I'm using the 1/8 inch measurements, and those are very easy to get confused with. So I put the washi tape there to make sure that I know I'm lined up properly with the ruler so that I'm not miscutting my strip width. And then of course for the flange part, my flange is going to be the pink. It's going to be the wider strip, so I'm cutting this at 1 5/8, so I have to move the tape to make sure I cut that at the right width as well. So now that all the strips are cut, we're going to sew them together just like you would normal binding on the diagonal. You're going to sew together the flange into one long strip, and then your visible binding part into one long strip. So those are going to be two separate strips, and you just sew them together on the diagonal just like you would any normal binding. I'm always chain piecing these because I just like to chain piece. Saves a lot of thread and saves me having to cut and restart in between every little seam. But you can do this however you would like. So now that these strips are sewn together, you can trim off the little corners on each of the joints, and just like you would with any regular binding, and then press the seams open for both strips. So we have both of those strips done, and they're going to get sewn together in the next step, but right now we're just treating them as if they were each a separate binding. So you cut off the corners, open the seam, press it, and do that for both of the strips. So now it's time to sew the two strips together. So you're just going to place them right sides together and line up the long edges, one of the long edges with the long edge of the other strip, and sew with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. You might want to make sure that the joints between the individual strips don't necessarily match up between the two strips so that it reduces bulk, but otherwise you just sew them together into one long strip. And then when we get to the ironing board, press the seam so it can set, and then you're going to open the seam up towards the narrower strip. So you want to press the seam allowance not open, but towards the narrow strip, the narrower one of the two strips. And just press your whole strip open that way. Once the seam allowance has been pressed, now we fold the strip in half like you would any other binding strip, just that this time when you go to fold it, there will be this little flange that is now visible. And the reason we folded, or we pressed the seam allowance towards, in my case, the blue strip, was so that it would lay under the blue strip and not get folded into that 1/8 of an inch flange that is now there. That would create a lot of unnecessary bulk. So just keep pressing that, and that is your binding strip ready to go. So to sew it on to the quilt, gotta change the foot here. I prefer to use the walking foot when I attach binding, just because it's so many layers. So to add the binding to the quilt, we're going to start on the back of the quilt with the smaller of the binding strips face down towards the backing. So backing and the narrower of the binding strips right sides together. And then you're going to sew it on with a 1/4 inch seam. Again, this is mostly just like any other binding. It just has a little extra bit attached to it. And here when you get to the corner, it's going to work just like a regular binding as well. So you're going to sew up all the way to the edge and stop a 1/4 inch from the edge of the quilt, right there. And then turn the quilt at a 45-degree angle and sew off the corner of the quilt. Turn your quilt around. I actually cut my threads there, but you can leave them on if you want. And then you're going to fold your binding up and back down so that you have the miter fold underneath it, and restart. I like to backtrack a little so it doesn't open up, and then start the seam again on the next side. Again, 1/4 inch, just like normal. Keep stitching it on all the way around the quilt and finishing it off to join the binding, just like you would any other regular 2.5 inch width binding. So however you normally do that, whether that's on the diagonal or straight on, whatever you prefer, you can do it the same way. So now that it's attached, we're going to press it, and then I like to use glue to fold the binding over to the front of the quilt. And now you can see where the flange shows up. And then press it down with my iron so that the glue sets. And this helps hold it in place so that I can focus on stitching and not have to focus on holding it or worry about pins getting in the way or clips. But you can absolutely use pins or clips, whatever method you prefer. Often for regular binding, I don't use a whole lot. I put a few clips in just so it doesn't move on me, but for a flanged binding, I really wanted to make sure it was right where it was supposed to be, so I used the glue method for this. So now you're ready to stitch it onto the front of the quilt. I still have my walking foot on the machine because I like the extra control over the feeding of the quilt that it gives me. The way this flange binding is getting stitched on is with stitching in the ditch between the flange and the binding, or basically between the two binding strips, if you will. So between the pink and the blue in my case, I'm stitching in the ditch there, and that's going to be nearly invisible on the front once you're done. Of course, you're going to have the extra stitch line on the back that is going to be visible, but on the front it's pretty much not there. Here's a bit of a better close-up of how this works with the stitching in the ditch. And take it slow. Don't try to race through this. You want to make sure that you're fairly precise so that your stitching remains as close to invisible as possible. Now, once you get to the corner, you want to hold your corners. You can use a stiletto. I didn't want, I was just using my finger there because I didn't have my stiletto handy, but you just stitch into the corner where the two flanges meet, or where the two ditches meet, I guess. Turn your quilt around, and then I'm having to adjust my needle position a little bit here, but you would normally just leave your needle down in the binding and spin the quilt, and then keep going on the next side. And here we have the finished result. So you can see the flange there, and it sticks up a little bit. And if I twist this, you can just about see the stitching in the ditch there. But from the top, it's pretty nearly invisible. And then on the back, all you have is one extra stitch line that is also not really visible in the grand scheme of things. So there we go, flanged binding.